comprehensive case for the resurrection of Jesus requires having to defend biblical inerrancy, the trustworthiness of the Gospels, and way too many extraneous details. Or does it? We'll explore the maximal data approach to a case for the resurrection with Dr. Lydia McGrew on All Rise. Hey, one thing you're going to notice is that Lydia is lying down. She's not lying down on the job. She's not overly relaxed, although I tend to be a pretty relaxing interviewer. I think the reason she is lying down in the position she is in is because she has chronic pain, a pretty serious pain condition, and that's the most comfortable position she can find in order to concentrate on the interview. So don't give it a second thought as you watch her. In fact, as this goes on, you won't really even notice. But you will notice it first. So that's why she's lying down. It's because that's the most comfortable position for her, given her pain level. All right, so on with the interview. All rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. If you're a subscriber to All Rise, you know that we've covered evidence for the resurrection at various times. In fact, the first few episodes of All Rise cover the evidence, and we go over some of the alleged contradictions that skeptics like Bart Ehrman bring up to try to debunk the historicity or the reliability of the resurrection accounts as found in the Gospels and in Acts. Now, my approach in those episodes and in my debates, and I've done several debates on the resurrection, has been influenced by several approaches, including what's called the minimal facts approach. And I described that a little bit, but it basically is an approach where you basically only argue from what the consensus of scholars, including critical scholars, will grant. I've also included some data from the maximal data approach. And I didn't specifically name those approaches, but I did, in fact, incorporate them. Well, today, friends, I've brought back Dr. Lydia McGrew to give us a positive case for what she's termed the maximal data or maximal facts approach to the evidence for the resurrection. And I'm excited to have her on because I do think there are really serious merits to this maximal data approach, and we need to wrestle with the different approaches as well. Lydia is widely published as an analytic philosopher and author, having received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She's published extensively on the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and its application to the evaluation of testimony. Now, and that's particularly important to me because as a lawyer, I like people who actually understand how testimony actually works and its probability theories and all the stuff that goes into all that. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in four books, including one we talked about in a previous episode called Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. And by the way, that was such a fun discussion. I got to say, the hour we discussed it went by so fast in the discussion, and when you watch it, friends, it's going to go by faster than you would like to. But the good news is she wrote a book that will take you longer than an hour to get through, but it's engaging and it's fun. And that's Eye of the Beholder. So that's 2 plugs now for that book that I think is very much worth your time. So with that introduction, we're talking about the maximal data approach. Welcome, Lydia. It's great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back, Abdu.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. And I have a sort of like an emotional affinity to this topic with you specifically and with Tim, by the way, your husband Tim, who is a professor of philosophy at Western, because when I debated John Loftus at Western Michigan University, and by the way, you guys can see, we're going to put a link to that debate in the description and in the show notes as well. Well, in the show notes for sure, because if you're listening to this on the podcast, on the audio podcast alone, you can't watch the debate on your podcast app, but you can click on the link and watch it on YouTube because it'll be there. I talked with you guys ahead of time about my approach, how I'm going to approach the debate itself. You guys provided some great information and some great insights, especially on the historical reliability of the Gospels. And also, Lydia, you helped. I sent you an email way back when I recorded the first episode of All Rise, which was at that point called The Defense Rests, where one of the episodes in the first series, the first season, I should say, was in response to Bart Ehrman's claims that the resurrection accounts themselves have sort of what he might say were irreconcilable fundamental and important differences. I don't think even if they were irreconcilable that they would necessarily debunk the entire case. It's much like if you see a car accident and you know that two cars crashed, but two witnesses sort of get some details wrong. We know the car actually crashed, so we don't have to necessarily establish every jot and tittle. But you helped me quite a bit with understanding how you can actually reconcile some of the, well, actually, the entirety of the accounts. And there's some great stuff out there on that. So thank you for that. Which leads, of course, to this idea of maximal data, because that approach and having to respond to the claims, and this is where I'm sort of going with this. So pardon the long introduction. So I want to hear more from you than I hear from me. But when I did that first season, I approached it in a minimal facts kind of way, rhetorically, and for the sake of brevity, and for the sake of sort of setup in one sense. But the reality is that when Dr. Ehrman went ahead and criticized the reliability of the resurrection accounts by going on to sort of what I would call smaller facts, like, should we really believe these accounts given that, was it one woman or many women that came to the tomb? Was it at this time of the day or at this time of the day? Did Jesus appear to them in Jerusalem, or did he tell them to go over here? And all that stuff. He's trying to basically say that if the surrounding details of an account are suspect, maybe the whole account is suspect, which I don't think logically follows. As a lawyer, I can tell you that doesn't logically follow. We establish verdicts all the time, regardless of the fact that certain extraneous details aren't always agreed upon. But I did defend the fact that they actually can be reconciled. So if I start off in one mode and then approach it from a maximal data approach, because the minimal facts approach doesn't require me necessarily to respond to that kind of challenge. But the reality is, I wasn't just trying to fill up an episode. I was actually trying to respond to a challenge that has some pretty strong rhetorical force. Because if you're just a layperson, and or anybody for that matter, and someone says, well, here's 15 problems with the differences between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, why would you trust any of it? There's a strong rhetorical effect to that, if not even a logical effect. So I went ahead and incorporated the additional data, which brings me to our conversation. Because I find great merit in being able to respond to that kind of argumentation. So, all that in mind, give us, to start off with, a brief explanation of what you mean when you talk about maximal data as an argument for the resurrection. And if you could also maybe dispel a myth about the title itself, because it seems a little onerous when you say the words maximal data. So go ahead, take it away.
From a logical, epistemological point of view, what characterizes the maximal data approach is something structural. And I'm all about structure. So in the structure of the maximal data approach, lying back of the argument that you make, and I might give you a 1-minute elevator version of this as we go on, but lying back of that is the idea that the Gospels are highly reliable documents, not necessarily inerrant, but highly reliable in the sense of reportage that we discussed on the last show when we were talking together. So that is there. So you're not going to grant that away. You're not going to say you're doing without it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to come along with a dump truck and dump all of your evidence for that when you give the maximal data approach, the maximal data argument. You can give it at various levels of length, depending on the time at your disposal. But you are not attempting to do without that as a background proposition that helps to undergird your argument. And that is then going to be a difference from the minimal facts approach, because part of the claim on behalf of minimal facts is that even if the documents are not reliable, the argument still goes through. So that serves as a kind of a clean division between minimal facts and maximal data. A maximal data person says, yeah, I know I'm going to disagree with the majority of scholars. I'm prepared to do that. But you don't bring forward everything, or you certainly don't have to bring forward or even try to bring forward everything that you have to say on that at the outset. So I think that's a good brief way of characterizing that distinction.
Yeah, so this brings to mind a an illustration that I would use in terms of the wisdom in how to actually proceed. And we're really talking about proceeding in two ways. One, we're talking about proceeding as a Christian, looking into, because plenty of Christians have never looked into the history of the resurrection. They just basically believe it because they had an encounter with Christ and they have this experience and they were raised to believe these things are true. And they say, okay, great, I take it for granted. I'd say the vast majority of Christians haven't looked in to see whether or not, what C.H. Dodd or Dale Allison or Gary Habermas or Mike Licona or Lydia McGrew or, Paley or any of these boys had to say anything about, or you or any other tremendous scholars who are out there. So if you're just making an inquiry for the first time, that's one approach because you're looking at it as a believer. But then there's also looking at it as a believer with someone who is skeptical or someone who is actually asking serious and sincere questions. So from that approach, I think back to the illustration I was going to start off with here was the O.J. Simpson trial. In 1990s or so, I was a college student, and I remember it was this thing that was broadcast all over the place. I might not have been a college student. I can't remember the year it was, but I was definitely at the university I was attending, and I think I took a gap year between that and law school. I was watching part of the trial. This is before I became a lawyer, and I remember sort of the whole section of the trial that had to do with the expert witness testimony, the forensic experts and the blood spatter people and the, DNA folks and all this stuff and the experts and the counter experts. And one of the criticisms that came from legal analysts was that the prosecution is spending way too much time trying to impress the jury with the sheer amount of expert testimony. And it had a counter effect, actually, which was they started to snooze at this stuff, and they started to say, this is just way too much stuff. You didn't streamline it. You gave us too much. The defense is making this take a long time, and I've just checked out. And what was rhetorically the most forceful part was, one, the Johnny Cochran statement, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And that's based on the prosecution made the mistake of having O.J. Simpson put the gloves on without actually testing whether having him do it in camera or sort of in camera means outside the purview of the jury, where they saw if the gloves would fit in the first place. One of the things they always tell lawyers is never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. And they didn't know the answer to whether that they would fit. They assumed it. So my point in bringing this illustration up is that sometimes if you have so much data, all of which might go to prove your point, and you provide so much of it that someone's like, they get bleary-eyed or their ears start to close off or whatever, as opposed to something pithy and short and smart, they tend to remember that. And that's exactly what happened in that particular case. So I say that because I think you're arguing to not go the O.J. Simpson route, even though you're using the words maximal data.
That's correct. Would you like me to give you my 1-minute elevator pitch version? Okay, sure. So I could have a 1 minute, I have a 10-minute on my YouTube channel, a 20-minute, a 35-minute, etc. So here's my 1 minute. Okay. We have enormous amounts of evidence that show that what we have in the gospel resurrection accounts are claims that were actually made by the people in a position to know whether they were true or not. This is what they claimed. Now, we could have 3 different possible explanations of the fact that they claimed these things. They claimed these things in detail. 1 would be that they were lying. 2 would be that they were in some way mistaken or muddle-headed or going beyond the evidence. And 3 would be that Jesus really rose from the dead. The first of those, that they were lying, is ruled out by the context of their claims, which we get from the book of Acts, which we also have lots of reason to believe is reliable. That context was so filled with danger and persecution that it argues strongly for their sincerity. The second option, that they were muddled, mistaken, irrational, is ruled out by the content of their claims. Because when you have those kinds of detailed claims, those are not easily explained by a mere mistake. If Jesus is eating with them, if he's offering to let Thomas touch his wounds and so forth. And so since both the lying and the mistaken options are ruled out by the context and the content of the claims that they made, we're left with the option that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
Okay, that's terrific. And I think that those three things, it's more like it's sort of a deductive argument to get rid of these things. Also, actually, it's more of a inference, the best explanation kind of a thing.
Well, it's a combination. What you're doing is you're putting your non-deductive stuff at the back of the premises of your trilemma. Right, so you can think of it as a deductive trilemma argument, but with premises that are individually supported by inferences to the best explanation.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so this is, again, going off script only because you got me some good stuff here I want to ask you a follow-up question on. And this happens to relate to one of the points that oftentimes people will use, whether they're using minimal facts or they're using minimal facts to get to maximal data, because I sort of feel like in some senses you use minimal facts and you end up in a conversation with sort of maximal data at some point, which has been something I've been thinking about for quite some time. But let's take the hallucination thing. Gerd Ludemann, they hallucinated it. They saw something. The disciples weren't lying. Now, one of the things about that is that that doesn't prove they saw a sort of veridical, yes, I saw him, and they even claimed to have seen him kind of a thing. But you take the three things that you just mentioned. They were lying, they were mistaken, or he's really raised. That fact alone doesn't really tend toward he was raised. It doesn't prove that, because what they said was we saw him physically. And Ludemann is saying that they, among others, that they hallucinated something. They had some kind of either ecstatic or a religious ecstasy experience or something, or hallucination or group hallucination, whatever it was. Can we use that, not in terms of a positive case for the resurrection, but to eliminate one of the possibilities? In other words, that they were lying. Because they clearly weren't lying. They fully believed it. Now we eliminated that. That helps to eliminate that. But it doesn't establish two or three.
So it's a very interesting question you're raising there. Because Ludemann or Bart Ehrman might be another example, would say they were sincere about whatever they did claim. But what did they actually claim? And I've actually been reading up on Ludemann recently and Ehrman. Ludemann is very unclear about what they even claimed to have experienced as a group. But one thing he is clear about is that all that physical stuff where Jesus seems to eat and all of that, he's tangible and so forth, that was added later. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like when you just hear the quote from Ludemann, the very famous quote that you always hear, that they really did have some kind of experiences, it's not always brought out. It's not just a matter of what explains those experiences. Ludemann doesn't clearly claim that they even hallucinated something that seemed to them like what was found in the Gospels, especially as a group. So it is, I don't think that Ludemann actually believes that they group hallucinated a meal with Jesus, or that they group hallucinated the doubting Thomas type sequence with Jesus. So Ludemann can say, they were serious about and sincere about what they claimed, but then it becomes super fuzzy as to what they actually claimed, because he thinks that our gospel accounts are corrupted and have stuff added. Some of the most exciting, most important stuff is added not even as part of the original claims of the witnesses. And that's where it becomes really important, whether or not the gospels are reliable. You remember in our previous talk, I said, well, if it's a miracle, at least what reliability means is that the account given here is something that came from the people in the position to know. And what you realize at a certain point is that these liberal scholars, they don't acknowledge that about the Gospels. They think a lot of the most exciting parts of it were added and were not even seeming to be part of their original experiences. And then that becomes a problem, because you're not unproblematically weeding out the lying option. You're weeding out the lying option sort of at the expense of watering down your resources for answering the mistaken option.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that to me would go to, because I've used that quote from Ludemann quite a few times, but I think that what you have to be careful, if you're going to go that route, what you have to be careful about is making sure you're qualifying it, and does that require more than it's actually worth? In the end,
I
it's like,
think it
okay,
does. I mean, I strongly
yeah,
urge people not to use that quote from Ludemann because there are so many qualifications you're going to have to make. And I think a lot of times when people hear those qualifications, they go, well, yeah, he's a skeptic. Of course he doesn't believe that Jesus really rose from the dead. And I'm like, that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's worse than that. He doesn't even grant that it seemed to them like he was physically there present with them. Even the phenomenological content, at least as a group, maybe he thinks the individuals privately, a couple of them had really, really exciting individual hallucinations. But when we get to our group experiences, I don't think he at all grants that phenomenological property was what we find in the Gospels. And that's kind of a big deal.
So then, if I were to go forward and say, okay, so we have these three options: lying, mistaken, or he really raised. What someone might think of is that in order to make a maximal data approach, you have to prove divinely inspired and inerrant. And the reason I say that is because I think this is something I think happens. Now, I don't know this I don't have data on this. What I do have is anecdotal experience from my own experience, is that oftentimes when you say reliable, I don't mean you, I mean you in the general sense, when one says
Right.
The Gospels are reliable, that you're using that to say divinely inspired and or inerrant. Now, without going into the issues of inerrancy and these kind of things, I think because these are often equated with each other, if not in meaning, at least practically speaking, that raises a sort of burden that you don't actually have to have. You can prove reliability without having to prove inerrancy or divine inspiration. You might be an inerrantist, but you don't have to prove it if you can prove reliability. You can be someone who believes that there are errors, and you don't have to prove you don't have to defend that hill or any other hill to prove reliability. So why don't we give a definition? When we say reliable, what do we mean?
Right, and that's a very good point. Well, to go back to the definition I gave of the reportage model, what I said was they were always trying to get it right, and they were highly successful. So this is compatible with their being perfectly successful, but it's also compatible with their being imperfectly successful. But what it's not compatible with is they're ever deliberately changing something. And, that fits kind of well with some of the examples you brought up concerning Bart Ehrman. You talked about Ehrman bringing up all sorts of alleged contradictions between the gospel resurrection accounts. Now, one of those is actually a pretty important alleged contradiction. Did Jesus first appear to his male disciples in Jerusalem or in Galilee? Now, that one, I'm not going to say, it doesn't matter. That's not just a teeny weeny little detail, because doubting Thomas isn't going to walk to Galilee before anybody's even seen Jesus for the first time, right? And it can't happen until days later. It takes several days to walk to Galilee. Matthew mentions that they went to a mountain that Jesus had appointed to them in Galilee. So they were apparently going to Galilee by that time with some expectation of possibly seeing him. Whereas in the account of him appearing in Jerusalem, it's a completely different thing. They're surprised. He's suddenly in the midst of them, and it's that very evening. So the circumstances are different. The expectation is different, and whether or not it allows very apologetically important things like doubting Thomas is going to be different. But on the other hand, let's take this one. Luke says that when the men from Emmaus got back, they spoke to the 11 and those who were with them. Okay? Well, now, if this is that very night, according to John, Thomas isn't with them. So that's only 10. It's not 11. All right, so even let's suppose that Luke didn't happen to hear that Thomas wasn't with them, and he meant it literally. He wasn't just using it as a title, and he made a mistake. He said the 11, and it was really only 10. That's the kind of trivial thing that doesn't undermine reliability. So when I talk about reliability, I'm talking about a level of accuracy. So real accuracy matters, and an intention of accuracy and a closeness to the facts that gives us the idea that when we have this, we have good evidence in favor of what it claims. Or in this case, good evidence in favor of this being an unembellished account given by those in the position to know, which could be inherent or not.
Yeah, and this goes back to our conversation from a previous episode where we talked about the passage by passage approach, where what you can look at is not, you don't have to be skeptical nor even neutral on whether someone says something now until you have good reasons to believe, maybe this statement is either a good faith error or a copyist error or an actual contradiction, whatever it might be. Given the overall reliability of the account, given the additional evidence we have for the reliability of that account in not only the specific story of the resurrection, for example, and the appearances, but the road to Emmaus, or what happened with the feeding of the 5,000, or location of certain towns, these kind of things. You find this kind of reliability, generally speaking. And so if there is a difficult passage where you're like, I don't know, maybe that isn't exactly how the others reported it, you can, even from a skeptical standpoint, you can say, but overall, these gospel accounts have been pretty reliable. And this goes back to the car accident case. I didn't do car accident cases very often in my kind of work, but here's the reality. If the blue car and the red car crashed at an intersection, and everyone knows that the blue car crashed into the side of the red car, and two witnesses are there, and both those witnesses have every indication of being reliable witnesses, and they get a little fact wrong. That has nothing to do with anything. Like, when they were, when they happened to have crashed with each other, a kid was riding his bike on the sidewalk, and that's seemingly irrelevant. And one says, no, there was no kid with us riding his bike on the sidewalk. Who cares? But let's say one of those witnesses is a terrible liar. A different story now. Now maybe it's like, well, why are you saying that particular fact and that kind of thing? Now, it might not be material in the end, but when you look at the overall credibility issue, you don't have the second scenario. What you have is multiple witnesses or multiple accounts from various eyewitnesses, all of which seem pretty reliable. So even granting if, and I don't think there are problems, but in this particular instance, but let's say if there were, they'd be immaterial. And if they were material, well, then the overall thing, though, tends to, I think, actually speak to the credibility of the overall account. So if there was a mistake or there was something wrong with a detail, we can move past it to a certain degree. I'm not saying we should brush past it and just not think about it. You have to consider these things if you're going to be intellectually honest. So here's a question for you. And this goes to, I want to jump around a little bit, but here's a question that I thought was important is, can a skeptic or an inquirer who's looking into this whole thing, whether honest or dishonest, what I mean by that is sincere or insincere, sidetrack someone who's using a maximally approach into trying to prove a bunch of stuff that's ancillary and you never get to the actual evidence for the resurrection? Is that something that is a peril of the maximal data approach?
I don't think it is a peril of this approach any more than any other type of argument. We all know that on social media, especially, somebody who's really determined can really work to sidetrack something. in an on-stage debate, there's usually a point where you present your positive case, and you've got control of that, how you're going to present your positive case. Then there might be a rebuttal place, and then they might have a time when it's like going back and forth. You're sitting actually facing one another. And at that point, you should do your homework and know what that other person's going to bring up and have your answers in hand. I think when it comes to contradictions, it's often really useful to categorize them, to say, well, this is a set of alleged contradictions based on the argument from silence, and that's a really terrible argument. Or, this is a set of alleged contradictions based on overreading a document and it doesn't actually say that, etc. And to be prepared to say that, to say, well, look, you just, gave me a whole bunch of alleged contradictions, and I think they all fall into this category or this category or this category, and that's why it's not necessary to go through them, one at a time. But we also need to set that against the fact that there is so much positive argument for reliability. And so in any context like that, you have to have the confidence of your material, just like a lawyer in court, so that you know how to keep the initiative. And that's going to be true whether you're doing a maximal data or a minimal facts argument. There was a 7-hour debate, I believe, between Barnum and Dr. Lucono, who does a minimal facts things. You could spend 7 hours on the minimal facts if you want. Or you can have a traditional debate on the maximal data, or you can spend days talking with your skeptic friend if that's what you want to do. But you decide what is then going to be appropriate to the venue and the context in which you're working, and you're prepared to look at these things from that larger bird's eye view rather than going, oh boy, I don't have to have an answer to that when my whole case is lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good. So if I were to look at one of the things that I think that you've talked about quite a bit, and we discussed it during a break at the last conversation we had, I took a note on it, was an argument, and I want to couch this in terms of like how my own sort of experience as a lawyer, and some of the things I was counseled on how to actually address with a fancy term that lawyers use, assuming arguendo, which is basically granting for the sake of argument. Now, one of the things that you have a position that this is actually a little more dangerous than we might make it out to be, that the phrase itself might make it to seem. What do you see as the dangers there?
Right, like if you granted arguendo that the Gospels are unreliable. So something we have to realize is that the majority of critical scholars, we're talking about these non-conservative scholars, they're the most impressive ones in minimal facts, right? Even Bart Ehrman, even Gerhard Ludemann, these skeptical or critical scholars. The vast majority of them are going to say that if the Gospels are unreliable, they are specifically and especially unreliable when it comes to the resurrection accounts. Okay, those are not going to be some of the most reliable parts from their perspective. Those are going to be some of the most unreliable parts from their perspective. And from their perspective, those accounts are rife with embellishments. So like I said about Gerhard Ludemann, when you dig in, and you find out that these guys think that all the most interesting parts are embellishments, right? The parts about him eating or being tangible or whatever, they weren't part of what was originally claimed by, Matthew and John and Peter and those actual guys who would have been actually there. They were added later as apologetic expansions or embellishments. Now we have a problem. Okay, because we've granted for the sake of the argument that the Gospels are unreliable. How now are we going to say, but we still have a really strong case because we're also trying to rely on nothing that is not granted by the majority of scholars. The majority of critical scholars, they think that the very things that we want to use, especially to argue for a bodily resurrection, weren't even claimed by those original witnesses, and that's part of the unreliability. They were inventions. They were just made up. So I think it's very hard to grant that for the sake of the argument and then sort of snatch it back. You end up actually playing a kind of a bait and switch, which is, of course, argumentatively illicit. So you say, and I'm going to grant that these are unreliable. Oh, not that part. No, they actually did experience as if he was in the room with them and as if he offered to eat and so forth. And they're like, wait, I thought you were making this argument only with what's granted by the majority of critical scholars. Now you've abandoned that. You're not doing that anymore. So it ends up being a kind of a false advertising. But if, on the other hand, we're consistent with a granting for the sake of the argument, we have really sawn off the branch that we're sitting on. So that's why I say that the hallmark of the max data approach is that you don't do that. Maybe even you say that you're not doing that. Maybe even you say, I do have information, and I'm going to dump it all on you right now, but I do have information that prepares me to disagree with the majority of what is believed by critical scholars.
So, I have a couple of series of questions that may or may not go to where the end of the question is going to go, depending on how this goes. 'Cause that's fascinating. I find that helpful. I also find this question coming into my mind right now is like, if, as in your study of this whole thing, do you think there are now, I understand the danger of. Let me back up and sort of formulate this in a way that makes some kind of sense. I understand that there's always an inherent danger, and this is true in my law practice as well, with relying on what are called the undisputed facts or undisputed material facts, because there can be disputed non-material facts. Who cares? They're not material by definition. Who cares? But if they're undisputed material facts, we would file what's called a summary judgment motion under Rule 56 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. The danger in relying on those undisputed facts too early on in the case is that they could become disputed or undermined in some way later on, and now you're sort of like, now what? And you have to rethink your strategy or rethink your case to some degree. And it happens all the time. It doesn't happen at a certain stage of discovery because typically discovery is long, lengthy, and comprehensive. That's a nice way of putting it. It's invasive. Let's put it that way. Yes, exhausting. It's invasive, and there's been references to proctologists and those kind of things. That's a euphemism. But by that time, you're pretty sure you know what the material fact, the non-material fact. Sorry, the material facts are that are undisputed. And sometimes it can help you win a case, and sometimes they actually win the case for you, and you're done. And you don't have to go to trial at all. So that's the context I'm going to ask the next couple of questions in. The first question is, from your standpoint, from the level of research you've done and the digging you've done, and I'm not going to ask you to say this comprehensively because I think that would be unfair, are there things that you would say that not a majority of critical scholars, but let's say some significant critical scholars would agree with about the historical Jesus? My first thought is, Bart Ehrman is not a mythicist. As an example, and he does believe that Jesus was a rabble rouser, and that I think he would also agree that, and he switches a lot. That's just part of the problem. He does. I have a blog article that I pull up all the time about the deity of Christ, where he says that Jesus is divine in all four Gospels, but in a different way.
Right.
But he didn't used to grant that at all. He used to say only John has him as a divine being, and now he's changed his mind a little bit, and he may have changed his mind since then. But let's just go back to the baseline. He would say he's not a myth. Okay, so that's already there. That he died by crucifixion. Now, already, we do have some level of evidential merit to that because, from my background as a Muslim, 1.8 billion people in the world believe that didn't even happen. And it's not a matter of history, it's more of a matter of theology on that particular point. So that's sort of I know this doesn't fit the definition of minimal facts, I get that. But in one sense, it's something we can build on. It's a non-disputed material fact about Jesus from a very credible or widely recognized critical source. Do you find anything else like that within not every single critic but a significant number of critics that would warrant mentioning would grant something about the historical Jesus that helps either a maximal data approach.
So it's interesting you should mention those two because those were the two I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
Jesus existed, right? But I think I'm sort of trying to urge people to not think they're going to get a whole lot out of that. Okay, there's a moderate scholar named E.P. Sanders, and you'll often hear people listing the facts that E.P. Sanders thinks are true because he's definitely not a conservative. But I think we ought to be prepared to kind of read them and go, that ain't really much. And I think part of the issue here is that people don't recognize there's this huge range between being a complete nutcase over here who thinks that Jesus never actually existed, okay? And then you've got all these different points in between, and then, way over here is making some set of fatal admissions such that, oh man, the Holy Spirit's after you now, man. You made those admissions, you just can't keep out the argument for the resurrection now. Okay, and there's like all sorts of different stopping points along there. So, I mean, you're right, of course, there are millions of Muslims in the world who believe that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. But in the grand argumentative scheme, even if you get a Muslim to the point where he goes, okay, Jesus died by crucifixion, we're still a long, long way from anything that's going to actually, from that sort of outsider perspective, support that he rose again. So that's why you have plenty of people, especially in Europe, who convert from Islam to atheism. They'll stop being Muslims and they'll just become skeptics. They won't become Christians. So now what? What do we have to do there? And I just don't find all that much that's all that exciting when you really kind of say, well, how far does this really get us? Beyond that, that's really granted by a large number of scholars when we examine what they mean by what they grant. And that's really important. What do they mean by the disciples had appearance experiences? Do they really mean anything very interesting or not? Which takes us back to what I was saying about Gerd Ludemann.
Yeah, and I get that. I definitely get that. I would say from my experience as a Muslim, so here, this is a part of a rhetorical strategy, so to speak, and I realize that's no substitute for substantive strategy. I totally get that. But as a Muslim, I would quote Bart Ehrman to people all the time.
They do. Absolutely, they do.
They love him, except when he is, sort of inconvenient to quote. And so one of the things that I think can get you there, and I think it does depend on who you're talking to and what is important to that particular person. So I've done dialogues with Shabir Ali. I know Mike Licona has, and David Wood, and you name it, they've all done it with him. And he's sort of unique because he's actually moved away from the position that Jesus wasn't crucified. He believes that he was crucified, but he just didn't die. I think that erosion of his, or not erosion, but his shift is probably a result of the historical facts. It's really hard to argue against this. Granted that even the scholars he likes to quote are like, hey, wait a minute, no, come on, the guy was up there. Then he uses other arguments to say that maybe he didn't die, he survived it somehow. So I'll just say from my perspective, that can be paradigm shifting depending on who you are. If someone like Ehrman or others who are critical of Christianity generally would say, well, hold on, we can't deny that he was on that cross, and we really can't deny that he died. That is halfway there in some ways, because now you have to account for what did in fact happen. Now that is where you're talking about. I think from that point of view, there's a lot more you have to establish, a lot more. So that's interesting. That's helpful. What do you think are the evidences? Let's give a couple of things. What do you think are the evidences that the disciples actually saw a risen Jesus, and that we should believe them?
Right. Well, again, that's talking about the explanation right? The metaphysical, like what really happened.
Yeah.
Well, so when I come to talking about there not being mistaken, so an example that Tim will sometimes give, he'll say, could you and a bunch of your friends, if it's in a college context, just be mistaken that you spent spring break with another of your best friends? And you guys are eating meals together and you're having big long conversations and you're walking around and all this stuff. Is that the kind of thing that you could just be mistaken about? And obviously, the answer is no, because you actually know this person and because you're interacting with him extensively. So let's suppose that the disciples actually said the things that we find in the gospel accounts. Okay, like, yeah, Thomas says, yeah, I didn't believe them. I told them, I won't believe unless I can put my hand in his side. Let's suppose this actually came from Thomas himself, that he said this. Then he came back, and a week later, there he was, and he said, be not faithless but believing, and here are my hands, and so forth. Suppose Thomas actually said that, and Thomas is saying this in the context described in Acts. This takes us to the sincerity issue, where it literally says that the disciples were beaten, and it looks like probably a fair number of the apostles were actually grabbed on that second occasion. By the way, C.H. Dodd says the second occasion of the arrest didn't happen, that it was a doublet, which means it was made up. So I'm just throwing that in here to show how little we can really rely on from these guys, even when it comes to something non-miraculous, something fairly believable, like that the religious leaders hated them, and when they wouldn't stop preaching, they arrested them another time and they beat them. So, Thomas, let's say, has been beaten, and he knows his life is in danger, and he comes back and he's like, yep, I'm still going to say that Jesus came back that week later, and there I was, and so forth. That combination of sincerity in the face of persecution and detail. Now, that's where we get into saying hallucinations are not going to cut it. Where people start talking about grief hallucinations, it is so interesting to see how they dodge, how grief hallucinations are seldom in groups. And even Dale Allison, who wants to attribute as much as he possibly can to group hallucinations, will not, he'll have to admit that we don't have any group hallucinations that include all of the features that we find in the Gospels, where they're literally all sitting around in a group and they're all like, hey, he's over there, and this guy's over here, hey, he's over there, this three-dimensional kind of thing, and pass the fish, please, and they passing the fish, etc. And they're talking with him for long periods of time. I'm getting a little off track here, but I want to give one really interesting thing from a footnote in Dale Allison. He literally says that in appearances of the dead, which he thinks may be real paranormal events, they typically utter only a few words. And then he says, this is consistent with what we find in the Gospels. What? Okay, and you go to the footnote because you're like, that's not consistent with what we find in the Gospels. Jesus preaches the longest, these long sermons to them about the prophets and he opens,
Emmaus Road, Luke 24.
Yeah. He opens scriptures to them. What do you mean? Only a few words. So you go to the footnote and he says, see so-and-so's article arguing that the original appearances of Jesus were nonverbal. And I'm like, oh, I see. It's consistent with what we find in the Gospels, except for all the parts of the Gospels that aren't consistent with it, which you're gonna chop off, okay? So that's how I argue, is that I go up against those critical scholars who are trying to take their scissors and chop this stuff out, cut this stuff out. It wasn't even part of the original testimony at all. And then I'm gonna push. And I'm going to say, okay, if this really was part of that original testimony, how likely is it that these guys were mistaken about it? How likely is it that they were all crazy in this extremely unprecedented way? Whereas if you're going to say, I'm only going to argue from what critical scholars grant, I don't believe hallucinations really becomes all that implausible, because hallucinations then are so minimal. In fact, what is seldom realized is that you could actually have experiences that would count against Jesus rising from the dead. So suppose you had experiences and you're all standing there and there's this floaty, hovery figure that appears in the room, right? And you go to try to touch it and your hand goes right through, and, this kind of thing. And then it goes, "Peace be with you," and it disappears. And that's it. That's all you experience. You don't experience anything else. That's an argument that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So just granting that they had some kind of experiences, maybe you're going to say, gosh, I guess there really are ghosts or something, but it could be actually an argument for something else instead of Jesus' literal bodily resurrection.
Yeah, so that, again, this is one of those conversations that I could go on for 2 hours on. And if I make my way out to Western Michigan, we can. So a couple of things. Dale Allison, I should say, brings to mind a couple of questions. And I'm curious about your reaction to this. Instead of saying, I want to argue based on only what critical scholars are willing to grant, and instead of saying, I'm willing to argue from some of what critical scholars are willing to grant, including maybe even a quote-unquote majority, whatever that is. I don't even know. Do you think that's different?
I think it could be. At that point, I would probably do what you just talked about with Jesus dying by crucifixion, because there's no ambiguity there. What does it mean that Jesus died by crucifixion? Hello. I think we know what that means, right? Or that Jesus existed. There's no ambiguity there. And what I would advise doing in that case is not arguing based on, they grant that they had experiences of the risen Jesus, because I think that takes us into this ambiguous territory where we're not really sure exactly what it is that they grant. So I would use that only for earlier facts where there's no disagreement, where I and Bart would actually give the same arguments that Jesus really existed, or many of the same arguments that Jesus really existed. There's no question about whether, he's basing it on some weird critical method that I'm not basing it on. We're both actually agreeing not only on the fact, but on what the fact, what we mean by the fact when we say it, and on the arguments that we're using to support it. And I would want to do that, and I wouldn't use it for what ends up being one of the very most important things they're having some kind of parents' experiences. For that, I would have to abandon relying on what critical scholars grant.
Yeah. So, again, not to flog the dead horse here, now that we've already talked about it, I think you've done a nice job of explaining your position on it, and I appreciate it very much. If I were to take a look at, and something you said about Dale Allison got me thinking on this line, is I've done this plenty of times, either in my evangelistic encounters or as a lawyer, whatever it was there's something you're willing to grant. Now, you don't grant 90% of the other stuff, or it's ambiguous what you really mean by this one fact. But I'd say, well, look, even you would agree. And then say, but I don't agree with this. I know you don't agree with that. I totally get that. But you would agree with this. Now, from this, so for example, he said, Allison says that they had sort of this religious experience that is very similar to almost like grief hallucinations. It's a few words, consistent with what we find in the Gospels. Well, hold on. What you are willing to grant is that the disciples had some kind of an experience, but it's not consistent with what the disciples report. So I'm not willing to go with you there. I can't go with you there because you're wrong. They record a lot about what Jesus actually did and said, and he passed the fish, etc. That kind of thing, as you guys have said. But we can start off with, you're granting there's something. I know what you're saying is very different from what I'm saying, but we're not saying that these guys. Again, it goes back to that. We're not saying they made this up. We're saying they're wrong. You're saying they're wrong. I'm saying they're not wrong. They had an experience, and they're not wrong about what they really do report. And here's a good case for what they do report.
So you're envisaging you're debating Dale Allison, or you're like sitting, I don't know, at dinner with Dale Allison, or you're
Right,
actually
whatever, yeah.
interacting with Dale Allison. Allison, I think, is a really interesting case because Allison believes in the paranormal. I mean, I sometimes characterize him as being kind of a cross between, I don't know, Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Barth, Arthur Conan Doyle, and David Hume. And actually, in a series of interviews he did, I think it was in 2021, he actually said there are four of me. I think he actually said four. And,
Oh,
I mean, he was kind of laughing at himself. He's
yeah,
very charming. But I think that's true. And the problem with that in actually interacting with Allison is that he has an answer for so many things, right? So he's going to go, yeah, I think they really experience stuff. So do the sort of the followers of this Buddhist mystic who say that his body turned into a rainbow. I did a series on
yeah,
rainbow body claims. And Allison will say he appeared to them later in visions. And it's like, well, okay, so now how do I argue that Jesus is different from that
right.
Buddhist mystic? So in a way, Allison's a little harder to debate with because he's not a total anti-supernaturalist. Okay, he just
Yeah,
wants to put all this stuff on a kind of an evidential part. That's where his bias lies. His
yeah,
bias lies in saying that any one thing is any better evidentially than any other thing, right?
sure.
So in a sense, I like to say Dale Allison calls the bluff of the minimal facts approach.
Interesting.
It's when you're dealing with Dale Allison that you've got to be prepared to go beyond that and just straight up say, yeah, I know that critical scholarship says that this stuff wasn't originally there. Critical scholarship is wrong, and I'm prepared to argue with you about that. And you're probably going to get to that pretty quickly in that kind of discussion with Allison.
I got it. Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Well, hey, we're running out of time. I do want to leave you with one opportunity to simply say, what would you like a listener or a viewer to know about making a maximal data case for the resurrection? Give sort of the, elevator pitch denouement, as you will.
Okay. Well, the bad news is you can't give a really strong argument, in my opinion, for the resurrection relying only on what critical scholars grant. But there's good news. The good news is we have overwhelming evidence that Jesus did rise from the dead if you're willing to go beyond that. And the further good news is you can tailor the length with which you state this argument to the time available to you. And I have done so. And I'll even provide links that give examples thereof. So go out there and grab that opportunity because it's not a burden. It's actually a privilege to be able to make the maximal data case.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great way to end it there. Friends, this has been All Rise. My guest has been Dr. Lydia McGrew. We will include links in the notes and in the description for her material on the maximal data approach and other stuff too. I mean, and do in fact avail yourself of her books. You will be all the better for it. My last thought on this, as I make my closing statement, is the evidence for the resurrection is, I think, quite convincing if you allow yourself the possibility to not just open your heart, so to speak, but actually have a real, sincere, intellectual dive into the evidence. And there are those who have a profound sense of what their faith actually is, intellectually and existentially, who are minimal facts proponents and maximal data proponents, all of whom think that there are great cases to be made for the resurrection. I urge you, as I think Dr. McGrew would do, and as anybody else would do who is a serious inquirer into these issues historically and epistemologically, make the assessment yourself. Look at the advocates, make the assessment yourself, and I think along the way you won't find yourself caring so much about the approach as you will about the strength of the evidence, because you look at both, you're going to get all of it. You might as well look at all of it. And I think when you look at all of it, you're going to find a compelling case for the resurrection of Jesus. And if you don't know him and who he is, I think you're going to find out. And if you do know him, I think you're going to be enriched. That's what I have to say about that, ladies and gentlemen. And until next time, the defense rests.